Well, good evening. It's been an absolutely wonderful day, and I would like to add my thanks to the organizers and everybody else who participated in the panels. It was, without a doubt, the best academic conference I've ever been to. I also want to acknowledge and thank the Arrow family. That was a beautiful set of speeches, and if there's an impossibility theorem, it's the impossibility of following that. But I will try, and I promised that I would be brief. We heard a lot about Ken's contributions to economics. I just wanted to relate two short stories about his conduct as an academic, as a professor, and as an advisor of students. The first story took place in 1972. I was in my third year as an assistant professor, and I was assigned to give a sophomore tutorial to one student. These are one-on-one classes. My student's name is Dutch Leonard. I don't know if some of you may know him. He's had an illustrious career at the Kennedy School at Harvard and now jointly with the business school. But at the time, Dutch was a sophomore, and we had our little session about whatever we were talking about, and then we were walking through Harvard Yard together. And just as a matter of idle conversation, I said, Dutch, who was your section leader when you took Act 10? Act 10 is the freshman course. And he said, well, he couldn't quite remember the section leader's name. Okay, that's what undergraduates are like. They don't quite know what's going on. But he couldn't remember the section leader's name, but he was very interesting, and he was very different than everybody else. He didn't follow the textbook at all. The textbook was Samuelson. Didn't follow the textbook at all. He wanted to talk about the meaning of economic welfare, the way national income accounts were done. Did GNP really represent what was going on in the economy? How do we measure productivity change? What about productivity in service industries? What about justice and things like that don't enter the national accounts? And I said, well, what did he look like? Because I knew a lot of the graduate students. I said, what did he look like? Oh, he was a little older. We didn't think he was a graduate student, but we couldn't quite tell. Well, of course, it was Ken. And that was an eye-opener to me because I had taught with him. He was teaching advanced material in graduate courses. And the idea of Ken being an Act 10 section leader just didn't make sense to me. So the next time I saw Ken, I said, did you teach Act 10 last year? He said, oh, yes, I did. I said, how did that happen? He said, well, the senior faculty in the department were unhappy with Act 10, but none of them had ever seen an Act 10 section. So they decided that each of them would take one section, and after a few years when they had all participated in the class, then they would decide collectively how to revise the course. So that was very interesting to me. And I said, well, what about, your colleagues? Of course, they never let the junior faculty in on any of this. But they said, what about the other people? He said, no. To my knowledge, to this day, Ken was the only senior faculty member ever to do a section of Act 10. And this is typical. He says, this is leadership by example, Ken Arrow style. He just did it. He made a promise to do it to his colleagues. He was the first one out of the batter's box. He did it, and no fanfare. If I hadn't asked him, he would have never mentioned it. So that was my first story. Second story is not just one instance, but many, almost countless instances where a student or a young faculty member, and myself included, would have an idea and want to talk to Ken about it. And the way he conducted these meetings was very often he would bring in some of us, young assistant professors, like Steve Chevelle and Truman Bewley and all the gang of us that were together. And the student was there and would explain his or her ideas, and we'd wait to see what Ken had to say about it. Well, as you can imagine, there's a whole spectrum of quality of ideas. Some of them are very good and they're almost done with their dissertation, and it's almost an exit interview. But the vast majority of ideas, projects, proposals by young people are slightly half-baked. And I include myself in all of that. that most ideas are not born fully formed. And so the question is, how did Ken react when somebody came in with a not so complete proposal? Maybe conceptually misspecified, maybe whatever. And the answer is, he never once criticized the person's ideas. Even when I thought direct criticism would be the most painless way to get rid of this problem, Ken saw something good in it. He saw something researchable. He saw something that the student could work on in the future. Maybe something would come out of it. He had a million different directions in which the person could go. And the result of these meetings, as you would expect, is the student left happy and enthusiastic about his work. Many of them, in fact, I would say almost all of them, believed that it was their idea after all. They just hadn't expressed it correctly. But actually, it was Ken's idea. He never took credit for it, and it was, again, a remarkable way of advising and encouraging young people, and for that, I'm particularly grateful. I had two theories about why he conducted these meetings that way. One is, he was just that nice. He couldn't criticize anybody because that wouldn't have felt right. He just wouldn't do it. But that may not be the case. He was very nice, but that may not be the real reason. The other reason may be, as Larry Summers said, he just couldn't imagine how confused somebody could be. So I don't know which of those two is true. It's empirically unidentified. He was very nice, and he was also probably incapable of understanding how confused we all can be.
Well, Jerry had two good stories, and also Dave Krebs has two good stories, so I'm going to make mine extremely short. I have fond memories of Ken when he was in his 40s. I met with him often in that period in Sarah House. These sessions were torrents of ideas, and each time it required weeks to digest. I'll just summarize by saying at that time, Ken said economics needed to include information effects, which in fact nowadays a lot of economics theory does. And I think that he was very clear and prescient at the time. And I will miss him enormously.
There's a clock here, but I'm not sure how to start it. I've only got 3 minutes, so thank you to the organizers. Beginning in the summer of 1999 and continuing through the year 2000, I conducted an informal survey of the colleagues that I met with one question. Who were the top 3 economists of the 20th century, rank ordered? Now, the good news is, in this room are a few people who contended for second place. But I gotta tell you, Ken crushed everybody. 90%, more than 90% of the respondents had him in the top 3, and over 50% had him as number 1. Why is that? What is it about Ken that made him, so now, it is true. I mean, I hang out with theorists, so maybe the sample's a little biased. But still, what about Ken did that? Now, in the talks today, we heard about how broad his contributions to economics were, and that was certainly part of it. But the question is, what was it about Ken, the way his mind worked, that made him so prolific in so many different fields? So let me tell you a couple of quick stories about the glory days of the IMSSS. This is like the 70s and 80s, up in the 4th floor of Encina Hall, where I always sat in the very back and watched the show. First story is about when Bobby Willig came to town. Bobby Willig was going to talk about perfect contestability. Now, just as Ross Starr described today, Ken put on his usual performance in the first hour. He came in a little late, he opened his mail, he flipped his pencil maybe 100 times, and then he fell asleep. In the second hour, he was revived by the coffee that we had between the first and second hour, and at some point a question was posed to Bobby, and Ken proceeded to give the answer, or started to give the answer. Bobby interrupted him. He said, "Professor Arrow, I know you're much smarter than I am, but I've spent many years thinking about this issue. You've thought about it for maybe an hour. I'm better prepared to answer this question." To which Frank Hahn interjected, "My dear young boy, And actually, Frank didn't use the word boy. Those of you who know Frank know what word he did use. My dear young boy, you are so mistaken. Ken gave his explanation. Bobby gave his explanation. Frank was right. Second quick story, Frank Fisher came to town. Now, Frank was unhappy with how it was that game theory had ruined the subject of industrial organization. And so he gave a paper called Games Economists Play, which basically said, I hate game theory, I hate what you guys have done to my subject. And as part of his talk, he said to illustrate the naivety of you game theorists, a prominent economist, I'm not going to identify him who it is, I don't want to embarrass him, was asked to provide testimony on a potential merger. And what this economist did is he computed the consumer welfare, or the consumer surplus, from the 5-firm Cornell equilibrium, and from the 4-firm Cornell equilibrium, took the difference and said, that's what will happen. Second hour came around, Kenneth said, by the way, I'm the economist who did that, and he proceeded to convince everybody that that was exactly the right thing to do. Everybody except Frank. Okay, so what's my point here? Ken had an amazing ability to see a model, see reality, and connect the two. He could see into models, he knew what they said and what they didn't say. That was, for me, the thing that made Ken Ken. He was the best economist of the 20th century, and that's why. Paul?
Well, I'll start this one. Well, I know we're all running late, and I had been debating whether to talk about personal things or intellectual things, and since we had the family who knew Ken so much better, let me just mention one intellectual thing that I would like to add to today. I talked to Ken several times during the last few weeks of his life, and I remember one of the last conversations I had with him was we all heard today about how important and impressive the formulation of the impossibility theorem was, social choice. He was having doubts about whether that was a good formulation. And we spent a fair amount of time talking about whether it made any sense to formulate social choice in terms of individual preference. He was thinking about the environment and about global warming, and he says, well, you know, how useful is it to think about global warming when most of the people who are being affected haven't been born yet? That was one of the thoughts. Another thought, he said, and he was talking about proving an impossibility theorem. The impossibility theorem he had in mind was, he said, well, suppose people were talking about global warming, they have intertemporal preferences, and suppose the world is, we think of the world as having been going on for a long time and will go on for a long time in the future. And we want to choose things in a way that's Pareto-optimal, and we imagine that, and we imagine that the social choice is stationary, then we get a dictatorship, because the guys who are most patient, well, in the long run, any Pareto optimum will give the most weight to the people who are most patient. And if we imagine that the world has existed for a long time and will exist a long time in the future, the only social welfare function that would emerge would be a dictatorship. And he also said, and apart from all of that, there is the question of, you know, whether it really matters. Maybe it's just wrong for us to be ruining the environment, no matter what individual preferences of people may be. So this was the conversation. This is about 2 weeks before Ken died. He was still not satisfied with what everybody here says was, or many people here say, was his most fundamental contribution, one where he established the foundation of the field. He continued to rethink that for right up till the end of his life. Thank you.
I'm Keitha Wright, and Gavin Wright and I met Kenneth and Selma in the early 80s, shortly after our family moved to Palo Alto. I'm going to begin by reading some brief remarks by Larry Goulder, who is winging his way to Paris as I speak, to a conference on the environment, which is a subject Kenneth and Larry worked together closely on for over 2 decades. And Larry writes, I'd like to offer a vignette to give a glimpse of Ken's fun-loving side. Ken loved reading plays, and I was lucky enough to be a part of a play reading group that Keitha Wright and Carol Dasgupta organized many years ago and that involved Ken and Selma and other friends. Each of us would take a different role as we read that evening's selected play. Ken would get deeply into his character, and I mean deeply. He would speak with an accent if called for, and he spoke with great verve. Several times he'd be overcome with laughter when he read a funny line, I can say especially by Oscar Wilde. It would take a minute or two for him to compose himself and continue. And when Ken read the lines of Teddy Brewster, the character in Arsenic and Old Lace, who thought he was Teddy Roosevelt, Kenneth laughed so much he had to pause several times to catch his breath. What a pleasure to experience Ken in those moments. Ken loved to have fun, and we all loved that about him. I regret I can't be here this evening. Regards to all. And thus endeth Larry's remarks. Years ago, Selma was telling me about when Kenneth won the Nobel Prize, and she said, "You know, dear, when someone wins the Nobel Prize, people think he knows everything." And I thought, but Kenneth does know everything. or so it very often seemed. And Kenneth's, we've talked about this all day, but his zest for learning, his satiable curiosity, his sharing of knowledge, and his using that knowledge very often to build a better world, informed his life and inspired and enriched all of ours. But just as important, Kenneth was a lovely person, and Kenneth and Selma were lovely people. They were modest and thoughtful and warm and kind. And Gavin and I feel very fortunate to have known Kenneth and Selma and to know their family. And I will say, in the immortal word of Teddy Brewster, who thought he was Theodore Roosevelt, in my best imitation of Kenneth's reading, delightful. And we will miss them very much.
I'm very sorry that I missed the sessions today because I had pre-committed to give a talk in Southern California, and they had sent out so many invitations that I couldn't make it. But just listening to you here and then talking to others, I wish I had been able to attend. But I want to just say that I really appreciated Ken and his work and discussions that I had. I wish I had been more selfish of his time. And I know he gave it so readily to everyone and the like. But I really think of him as being one of the founders of financial economics, an area in which I have done most of my thinking, and especially trying to understand uncertainty and information asymmetries and market prices and risk transfer, et cetera. So he's just really a phenomenal contribution. And my work, in some sense, even though I didn't know when I did it on option pricing, it was subsumed and very, very important in the ideas of the state contingent pricing and what we can learn from that, especially about thinking about the tails of the distribution and how those things are so important for our lives and for everything we do in science, can only be done by really understanding the full plethora of prices and how they impact our lives. So I'll miss them, and I really appreciate the honor of standing here today and honoring him. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
We heard today that Kenneth Arrow had 5 identified doctoral students who went on to earn PhDs. I consider myself the 6th undocumented student who did that, and let me tell you how that came about. In 1961, Leo Hurwitz sent me to Sarah House for the summer to work as Ken Arrow's research assistant. Ken detailed me to Mark Nerlov and Hiro Uzawa. I ended up spending maybe 2 or 3 hours total during that summer talking to Kenneth, but those were very quality minutes. It gave me a thesis topic. It gave me eventually a theorem, an impossibility theorem for multi-input CES production functions, and perhaps most importantly, it gave me an insight as to how to use duality theory not only in economic theory but also in econometrics for econometric specifications. Now, one of the reasons that I had so few contact hours with Kenneth that summer was that 10 days after arriving at Sarah House, I came down with the mumps and was sent off to the San Mateo County Hospital isolation ward for 3 weeks. And during that 3-week period, I had one visitor, and that was Kenneth Arrow, who took a graduate student of uncertain providence and prospects and made the trip to cheer me up. And we had a nice little conversation about duality theory. He was wearing his mask, and I was exuding viruses, I suppose. But in all the humans I've met in my long life, I would certainly put him in the very top list of the best humans. Thank you.
Some glimpses of long memories from Kenneth Arrow. Now, stories about his vast knowledge abound, but I'll tell one personal one where I was involved. The first time Kenneth came to Israel, I took him to the desert, to the fortress where the last holdout of the rebels against the Roman Empire, 70 AD, and on the top of the mountain there, on the remains of that fortress, I started telling him what I read the day before from Josephus, the only source of knowledge about the fate of the Zealots there, committing suicide eventually, the War of the Jews. And I started telling Kenneth, and he stopped me and said, yes, what Josephus wrote I know, but recently there was some new evidence from Plutarch that contradicts Josephus. Anyway, I stopped there and I decided homework will not do. In the summers, we used to hike for 20 or plus years every summer to the Yosemite, to the higher Tuolumne Meadows. And I remember one night in the highest camp called Vogelsang, we sat in a magic night, the stars are over our head, and Kenneth said, at this spot, some crucial link in the proof of the impossibility theorem came to me at this spot. I came back to that spot a number of times, and I can tell you it doesn't work for everybody. This was Kenneth. This was only for Kenneth. For Kenneth. Now, Kenneth was good in almost everything, but not in everything. Sports, for example. On Sundays, we used to play badminton in the Charters yard. What Kenneth did in badminton can only be described as unnatural body twists, with awful results, of course. But Kenneth didn't mind; he took it in stride. And finally, I want to tell you about something which has not been mentioned here: Kenneth's, not politics, but Kenneth's opinions. In those days, when Kenneth was young and a student and so forth, quite a number of his friends were leaning to the radical left. Marty Lipset, who was a professor here at Stanford, was the Secretary General of the Communist Party Youth. Norman Podhoretz, Crystal, they were all Trotskyites and communists and so forth. Kenneth never went in that direction. He was level-headed, and I hope Anita and Larry will agree. I called him a Jackson Democrat, what used to be called the Jackson Democrat, after Henry Scoop Jackson from Washington State, who was very liberal on rights and so forth, but strong on American defense and army and so forth. Kenneth was in that direction. He always put me straight also on the issues of Israel and the Middle East. He was a realist, never went for the radical fringe and so forth. but at the same time, of course, promoting human rights and liberal ideas and so forth. I miss my frequent conversations with him, transatlantic conversations, and I miss him personally terribly.
Yeah, I too was going to bring you 3 moments in Kenneth Arrow's life. And as a foreigner, I believe that you'll forgive me for confusing 3 minutes for 3 moments. So the 3 moments in Kenneth Arrow's life may take up a little bit more than 3 minutes. And the thing that throws me off over here is the management of this conference. The three organizers, they really run a tight ship. And about 2 weeks before today, they sent around a flyer or an email saying telling us, the speakers here at the end of the event, don't just stand up there telling stories. You should make sure and give the broader significance of what you're saying. So I'm going to try and give you the broader significance of these 3 moments. And that may result in it taking up a little bit more than 3 minutes. I'm sorry about that. So the first of these 3 moments, and I'll go over to the broader significance at the end. Okay. So the first of these 3 is actually my second ever meeting with Kenneth Arrow. And I had come to Stanford University to study under the 37-year-old Kenneth Arrow. And after presenting myself to him, I decided it was time to go see the big city, the great city of San Francisco. So at the first weekend, I drove to San Francisco and pretty soon found myself driving down Market Street. Market Street was more seedy than it is today, but it's the same Market Street, and I was driving down slowly, peeping about and looking around, and pretty soon I came up to a Woolworth store on Market Street, and I look at the store, and lo and behold, there is a picket line picketing the entrance to Woolworths. And it turns out that Woolworths were running segregated lunch counters in the South, and people in San Francisco were urging passers-by not to enter Woolworth because of what they were doing in the South, and there were about 15 of them picketing along over there. And lo and behold, I take a closer look, and one of the pickets is Kenneth Arrow. And so I really was flabbergasted. A professor where I came from, going on the picket line, that was unheard of. It's more so, it's more okay these days, but not in those days. And so I double parked the car and ran over to the picket line to say something to Kenneth Arrow. And I came up to him, and he recognized me, and I said, "Professor Arrow." And he saw that I was so shocked, and he said, "Did anything happen?" So he was sure that I was there to recruit his assistance in something very terrible that had happened. And when I sort of motioned that nothing had happened, he just picked up his sign and went on picketing. And now to the broader significance of this anecdote, and that is, I think, the fact that alongside Kenneth Arrow's achievements in science and scholarship, we should always remember his achievements and his contribution in standing up for human rights and in protesting violations of human rights. That was my first encounter with that back in those days, but he kept this thing up throughout his lifetime, and he was seen to be standing up for human rights, not only in the United States, but also in places like Greece and Turkey, and yes, also the State of Israel. So that's moment number one. Moment number two has to do with classical music, which Anita has just reminded us was always in the background in their home. And Kenneth was exposed to classical music and to music in general in a very, very serious sort of way. But he always claimed that he knew nothing about music. On several occasions, he complained about not knowing enough, or more precisely, about not having taken the time to acquaint himself more thoroughly with the world of music. And he thought that he didn't know enough, or didn't know. In fact, he said, "I know nothing about music." So this is a case of somebody knowing something but not knowing that he knew it. And that's a serious thing it's a big deal for those 5 of us worldwide who are interested in this sort of thing. He knew music, and I will say something about this in a second, but he didn't know that he knew, which is the broader significance at the beginning. Now, the anecdote itself actually takes place at our home outside Jerusalem, where there was a dinner taking place. David, you might have been there at the time. It may be one of the ones that you were with us over there. And there was a conversation taking place, and Mozart operas were being discussed, and the question came up, why don't Mozart's great operas have any dance sequences in them? And someone, I forget who, gave the answer, namely that the Kaiser in Vienna at the time, Joseph II, had issued a decree banning all dances and all dancing from Viennese stages. And as a result, Mozart wrote his operas without any dance sequences in them. And we were just about to go on to something different when Kenneth Arrow said, and of course, we have Christoph Gluck. Actually, he said Christoph Gluck, but he meant Christoph Gluck. And who was Christoph Gluck? He was one of the 2 court composers for Joseph II. The other one was Salieri. And Kenneth proceeded to tell the story of Christoph Gluck, who got so fed up with the emperor's decrees and shenanigans that he just left Vienna and went to Paris, where he proceeded to revise his, whatever it was, 24 operas that he had written in Vienna, and introduce dance sequences into his operas, including the famous Dance of the Blessed Spirits, which arguably is one of the greatest pieces of music ever written. So if you ever go to hear Orpheus and Eurydice, make sure that you have the Paris version and not the Vienna version, because of this piece that he added when he got to Paris. So that's number two, and the last one is several years after that, and Kenneth was visiting Jerusalem, and at the same time visiting Jerusalem was the renowned violinist Isaac Stern, a great artist, and I decided that the two should meet each other. So I take Kenneth over to meet Isaac Stern, and after I make the introduction, Kenneth sort of raises his hand and he points at me and he says to Isaac Stern, "My student." And Isaac Stern, without the slightest pause, says, "Is he going to graduate?" So Kenneth comes out laughing, but I get the idea that the answer to Isaac Stern is surely no. That with Kenneth Arrow, you never graduate. You every time you see the man, you learn something new, and as a result, there's never time to graduate. To witness the story about Gluck, and so I thought to myself, here's something which I need to think about, and so the broader significance of this one is that here I am back at Stanford University after all these years, so maybe I can sneak into some office and finally get myself graduated. Thank you very much.
Well, there's not much I can say about Kenneth after all of these now, but I do want to start with 1946, the fall of 1946, when I was a graduate at the University of Chicago and lived in Hitchcock Hall with Selma Schweitzer. And I can remember the day with my friend Selma when we were visiting in the entranceway, and she comes running in, puts her arms around me and says, "Oh, I've just met someone." And who did she meet? She had just met Kenneth. And the beginning of she was just ecstatic and over the moon. I was a graduate student. Ted was at the Coles Commission. And we became good friends ever since. And there's one time, 2 years later, when we visited Rand Corporation, and Kenneth was there in the summer. And then fast forward many years, and Ted and I are here well, Ted's gone now, but I'm still here. We're at Stanford now because of Kenneth. Kenneth, and all right, Larry, several others brought Ted here from Columbia. And when soon after we got here, they left. Kenneth and Selma went to Harvard. And this sort of thing happens back and forth. But they eventually came back. And I remember Selma asked me when they knew they were coming back and they were going to build a new house. And we lived down the block on Santa Ynez. And I would regularly watch carefully as they were building your house on Santa Ynez. And what could I say? Over the many years of friendship, and how last year Kenneth was still here, Ted was gone, and he gave a wonderful memorial for us. And we're still good friends with everybody. And all I can say is, well, you've heard all kinds of wonderful things about Kenneth today, and I can just say I agree with it. Thank you.